Join us for the Criterion Institute podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute podcast. It's December 2024, and Criterion is in a full-on push to prepare ourselves for a Convergence, our conference, in February that is focused on reimagining the future of gender lens investing. And Debbie Evans on our team noticed that it is actually 10 years since we wrote the first State of the Field report. And so, in this podcast, I want to look back to that report, which I think has actually had a pretty decent shelf life. There are some pieces of these reflections that are a bit depressing, that say, oh my goodness, that thing that we said should happen 10 years ago, still planning on getting that to happen. But there are some places where the problems have gotten more complex. I'll consider that also a win because we can see the complexity of them versus the naive minds that we were 10 years ago. And there are some places where we have made tangible progress. So the focus of this episode is on the State of the Field report that Katherine Miles and myself wrote in 2015 that framed where we were as a field and set up a roadmap for how to move forward. Enjoy.
Join us next February for Criterion Convergence 21, Reimagining the Future of Gender Lens Investing. Convergence is Criterion's signature conference and a unique, deeply transformational experience that leads participants from framing to implementation over 4 weeks of structured conversation. Attended by global leaders from investing, government, and civil society, Convergence 21 will provide critical framing for anyone building more gender equitable futures. Let's reimagine those futures together. Find out more and get your ticket today at criterioninstitute.org.
The State of the Field of Gender Lens Investing had one strategy as a report. We were about 5-7 years into building the field, and I wanted the report to be fat enough that people would actually think something was going on. So when people said, no, you just need to make it like a 15-page report, I was like, no. It needs to be over 100 pages so people have a sense that there is 100 pages to write about the field of gender lens investing. So we clocked in at 140-ish, if you include the appendices. And I think it is a really rich report. I will say Katherine Miles did a lot of the research and the framing with me. And another person who was critical to all of this is actually Susan Gibbs. Not only did she, through the Wallace Global Fund the report, but she was the best copy editor I've ever had as a funder. I would say things got a little rocky from time to time. There were things that just had to be a certain way because she was smart about how to convey things. So I'll take responsibility for the errors and give her a good amount of credit for the structure and the clarity of the report. So here I am 10 years later, reflecting back. And I will say, as I record this, I'm sure my podcast editor would suggest that I not do this, but you're going to hear some page turns here because I literally have the report sitting in front of me as I flip through some of the pages and do some highlights. So the overall structure of the report, because it was really hard. I think one of the accomplishments of this report was that we figured out how to name what was going on. And so we had three broad sections of the report, sort of looking at what are the lenses. It was both about the lenses of innovative finance, because gender lens investing was just coming out of so many other trajectories of how to think about finance for social change. But also, of course, how do you actually think about a gender analysis as a lens? And then we talked about making a market, right? What are the different ways that moving capital, the roles of different investors, the roles of standards and measures to be able to make the market? And then finally, we ended with a roadmap for the field. And that's actually what I want to focus on. Allow me to turn to that page of the report, which is very close to the end. It was kind of a summary throughout the report for each section. We named directions forward pithily, but then at the end, brought it all back together. And the structure for the recommendations is a framework that Criterion has continued to use since we wrote this report. Because we said there's three parts of the field of gender lens investing. And I would say this really comes from a study of how fields develop overall in different types of fields. We talked about a field of ideas. What is gender lens investing? How do you define it? What do different people think it is? How do you bring the research together? How do you tell stories about the field? How do you tell stories in the field? Second was about activity, looking at products and vehicles, thinking about how we measure the activity itself, the movement of capital. And finally, the third piece was looking at people and organizations, whether that's the training or the convening that's coming together to sort of build the field, but also thinking about what is the expertise needed within the field. So we ended up with people and organizations, activity, and ideas. And in some ways, these draw on different types of fields, right? So in academics, a field is almost always defined by its ideas. I am a social historian distinguishing myself from a political historian, or I'm a behavioral economist distinguishing myself from another kind of economist. Can't think of another one. So you're thinking about what are those distinctions between the ideas, and fields in the academy are about those ideas. At the time we wrote this report, there was actually a good amount of research emerging, had been for about 10 years before, about how do you think about a field made up of people. So we had actually been working with the Packard Foundation of the field of sustainable fisheries, and who are all the people and the organizations who make up that field, how they see themselves as a whole. This was about fields of practice. Actually, our board member, Michelle Kahane, wrote a bunch about how fields develop from her work at the Ford Foundation, where she funded a good amount of field building work. Impact investing, though, had largely been defined in this third category as a field of activity. The stories of the field were about the products that were being developed. They were about how much capital moved and to whom, and how did you track how that capital moved. It was much more about the activity. And so we wanted to bring together those different perspectives in the field of gender lens investing. So starting with turning a page here, a field of ideas. So I'm looking back at the report, and the first phrase here is about framing and translating. Oof, I would say we are still working on that one. We're no longer naming that it's important, though. I think the progress we've made is acknowledged to be that something that's important, the need to translate between knowledge of gender and knowledge of finance. Now the question is, what's the business model around it? How does it actually work? And I think maybe if I look at some of the recommendations and the strategies that we talked about at the time, I think we saw this sense of like, if we could get this right once, everybody would be able to talk to each other, like sort of this imaginary Rubik's Cube that it would allow us to talk across these different types of expertise. Well, that's not the answer. There is no Rubik's Cube that allows us to do that. Okay, that's really funny. Not a Rubik's Cube, a Rosetta Stone. I will say this kind of feels more like a Rubik's Cube in many ways of how the strategies come together, but a Rosetta Stone for what would allow us to translate between finance and between gender. And so thinking about how women's rights organizations can bridge, because in the end, it gets to the second piece of really looking at the research and the data. Still to this day, there's so much of the data that we're drawing on for gender lens investing that comes from finance. And that makes sense, right? You want to make the business case, you want to talk about performance. But the data around gender really comes from women's rights organizations. The data around gender comes from NGOs and others who are research organizations who are studying what's going on in the world, studying gender patterns. And so at some point, we really did need to figure out how to bridge to that research. And so we were naming this very much in the beginning of uncover and aggregate data about gender patterns in open systems to ensure that knowledge, that there's a core of knowledge driving the field and that doesn't become proprietary. I think one of the things what we were worried about then was a couple big firms would would sort of aggregate all the gender data. And I think about folks like Equileap who drive a lot of data today, but they're so generous, even though their business model does require that they are proprietary. They are still incredibly generous in how they work with others and partner in the field. And so then the last piece was about amplifying and curating, to amplify the messages of the field, organize a formal speakers bureau. Oof. I remember Suzanne Beagle always wanted a speakers bureau to be able to put together all the people who we could sort of dial in and that you would know who to call to speak about different topics. I would say in many ways, we have amplified different voices, but not enough. So often the same voices are heard over and over again. And as we wrote Disrupting Fields 5 years later, really reflected on how we want to stay away from making sure that it's just one voice. All right, so the second category is a field of activity. So this is what we think about all the time, right? How do we, the first category that we named here was design and demonstration. And some of this had really come out of the research that we had been doing in Asia at the time, which talked about the need for space to really creatively come up with new ideas. And that we need to do more demonstrations that prove, as we said here, the validity of the field and push what we see as possible. Oof, Criterion's been saying that for a long time. Let's expand what we see as possible. So the second piece was really looking at the products and vehicles. What are the products that will move things forward? And in some ways, the key strategies that we named here were about incentives. First, what is the incentive to build a better product? I think we're still talking about this today. There's a good amount of funding that still is made available for people who are looking to design a gender product and don't feel like that falls within the normal course of their business, but that's something that should be philanthropically funded or funded by a donor agency. But the other piece that was here is about wealth holders and individuals collectively advocating for better analytics. And this is a piece I've been reflecting a lot and having more conversations as we get ready for Convergence. So much of where we sat at this time was a sense that there was a wealth transfer happening and that there were women with wealth who would demand better products. I'll come back to that, but a lot of the assumptions were that we were having individuals or organizations who would advocate for these products. And that happened. I mean, people have, I mean, I think about the work that Molly Gotchman and Stardust has done to really push asset managers to do better, right? Just some glorious progress made. Ruth Shaber has pushed in so many ways. Wow, there wouldn't be as vibrant a field of reproductive justice and the investments made around it without Ruth. And so there have been individuals. What there wasn't, though, was a flood of capital. And maybe we never thought there was going to be, but it would have sure helped if there had been a avalanche of capital that followed all of these ideas. But if wishes were dollars. So then the third piece here is really looking at the standards and the metrics. And I will say this is a place where the field overall has just made extraordinary progress, right? This was written years before 2X. Criteria came together years before. We were at this time, I think a couple years after that, we wrote the GIN metrics. But we were looking for, how do we build the metrics of the field and think about what are the different markers? And this is maybe a place that Criterion has sat relatively consistently for a long time, which is, as we look at the field overall, we really need to think about multiple ways of measuring. And that's a privilege that we have as a global think tank, right? We can say there needs to be a variety, and then there's a whole bunch of organizations who need to push for their market, their place in the market, and why their product needs to truly get the backing that it deserves. And so from that perspective, it looks like too many standards dilutes the efficacy of any individual standard. But in some ways, the opposite is true. The more standards you have, the more they rub off of each other, the more they push off each other, the more they challenge each other. And frankly, the more territory you can cover, because one standard is never going to work for everyone. The one other piece that I thought was really interesting is that we talked about the need for watchdog organizations to make sure that gender lens investing does not tip into pinkwashing. And I think in many ways, I still wish we had a better watchdog organization. We've had some, right? The report from AWID was calling things into question. That was written a couple of years ago that sort of questioned the field of gender lens investing. But at some point, you need people like, I always think about this as Greenpeace, right? Within the field of environmentalists, Greenpeace is sort of the watchdog, the one that says not good enough. And what's good about Greenpeace is they're actually in the field. They understand what not good enough looks like. And I wish we had more of that. I wish we had people inside of the field really pushing to say we can do better. And maybe that's part of the role that Criterion plays. I was so, one of the things that's advanced the field is that the Canadian government supported 2X and Andy and Criterion to really look at how to up the game in the field of gender lens investing. But looking at so many different actors who play different roles, and I want there to be critical dialogue. I want people to say, I think we can do better here, or I acknowledge that you tried there. That's really cool, but can we try something else also? And that we just need more and more experiments and more pushing versus a single solution. Recognizing that organizations need to have a single solution, which brings us to the third category of looking at people and organizations. And I think at some level, this has been one of the hardest parts about the field of gender lens investing. I think about the organizations that were forming 10 years ago. And in the last 10 years, organizations like 2X, Gender Smart, Equilo, Value for Women, actually many different organizations that came together for their purpose to be in the field of gender lens investing. And I think one of the challenges that we've had is many of those organizations have struggled to get traction and struggled to find adequate funding, Maybe that's true in every field. It's an early market, takes time to make sense of things. But I really, and I'll say from the flip side, organizations like Value for Women, who I think are in such a strong place, Adesina, wow, like Adesina didn't exist 10 years ago, and now I believe they're rocket ship about to take off. And so many different organizations coming together to make sense of this. Was just hearing today again about the exciting work of Invest for Better and what's coming together within that organization. So many different organizations coming into being. And maybe somebody else needs to say this is true of all fields, but dang it, every single one of those organizations has struggled to come into being, struggled to stay in the game. And so I think the sort of, we could have lots of conferences, we could have lots of places where things were coming together. We've had some great gatherings, but they've been hard fought. And they take a lot of effort. They take a lot of risk. They take a lot of energy, just the force of nature of people who say, somebody like, Jessica at 2X, who has just sheer will after so many years pulling this together and pulling together an organization and leading it. Just enormous respect for what happens. I think part of this was also about building community and figuring out what are the ways where we can really extend that community. And Gender Smart, for many of us, was a place, but it had its own faults. It had ways in which it was narrow and didn't necessarily include quite a few people, actually. So it was an important community for some, but not for all. So how do we think about the different ways to build community? But I do know that community is required, and not just community inside of an organization, but crossing it. The second was about training and practices. Oh, look at me turning the page again. Here I am turning the page, getting towards the very end. So the training and practices, just extraordinary tools that have been built by so many different organizations. I think about all the extraordinary work that Sagana has done, and the pieces that were built out of investing in women, a DFAT program in Southeast Asia, both our role and then Value for Women afterwards. There's just been a lot of resources that have been built over the years. So I think we've done pretty good on this. Maybe gotten stuck a little bit often in sort of just the research or the training that makes the case, but doesn't actually get people to go do. I wish there was more training about what would enable us to go do, as opposed to just training that convinces people to do. We spend so much time convincing people to do, then they're like, well, I've already spent this time convincing you. You've now convinced me to do, instantly enable me to act. That doesn't work that way. So I've always found that funny, right? Like, people will take a really long time to be convinced. And then as soon as they're convinced, they somehow want the action to be instantaneous. Well, welcome to the field. It takes so much longer. So then the final section we had here was about expertise and credentials, and looking at the need to design curriculum for business schools and gender studies programs, joint degree programs, thinking about professional titles that signal being good in gender lens investing. Well, I think it is. I think there are thousands and thousands of people who see themselves as working in the field of gender lens investing. And how remarkable is that? That there are people who raise their hand and say, yeah, that's what I do for a living. Oof, that's pretty cool. And we're still struggling to figure out what makes it viable to say that. Is that just because you're a woman and you can lead a fund, and is diversity enough? Or is there really expertise and credentials needing behind that? And we had made some progress. There are definitely quite a few PhDs now in gender lens investing. I think at the time where we were writing this, the first person was finishing her degree in Oxford. But more people have now studied. I think it's a little more integrated. Again, the work that Ruth Shaber has done within University of Pennsylvania, the work that happens within the Wharton School, what Sarah Kaplan has done within the Rotman School. So many examples of the sort of building out the training ground for how people will learn how to do gender lens investing. So I am so excited to have everybody come together in February and during Convergence and think through, from your perspective, where are we at? Where do we need to be pushing farther? The structure's in place. A lot of the fundamentals are in place. We just need to move. We need to push. We need to continue to walk forward. Thanks.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.